Now, out of this initiative, the AI initiative, was born VoltIQ. Its first release was in the form of Dharma GPT. Finally, the VoltIQ was also a finalist in Gyan Bharatam in the AI competition. In European colonization, there's a dialectical relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. They then create organizations to institute fabrications in the society of the colonized. How many organizations? Well, there's not even a good count of it, because no one has done an exhaustive survey of the institutions that were created during colonial times that still persist today. Now, how do we create and build AI systems that reflect these plural moral worlds? That's what we frame and call a Sanatana AI. We need to invest in fundamentally building data sets for training purposes to develop a full Indic native foundational model. Today we'll talk about the colonial discourse, that is all-pervasive narrative that we don't even question when we see it in our lives, and the need for Sanatana AI, and what exactly Sanatana AI means, given the various different meanings that that term has come to encompass. But first, we'll give an introduction both to myself as well as the Institute before we dive deeper into this topic. So I'm the founder and CEO of Institute for Civilizational Studies. We're focused on addressing long-standing imbalances in global narratives on Hindu and Indian civilization through both academic and AI research. Professionally, for most of my career, I've been focused on AI and enterprise infrastructure at big-name tech companies such as Cloudera, Dell, and Amazon. By way of education, I did my MBA at Harvard Business School, my master's and bachelor's in computer science and computer engineering from Cornell University. So the achievements of the Institute will focus first and foremost on Hindupedia, which is an encyclopedia you've probably seen at some point over the course of the last 2 decades. It is something we've been working on since 2007, has over 12,000 articles and over 1 million users a year. It has, most importantly, 140 academic citations, making it the largest online property that is of its nature and fully and broadly academically accepted globally. We also published last year Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. At 47,000 downloads in the first year and a half of its publication, it is in the top 1% of all open access academic works ever produced over the course of history. This is interesting also because it seems to have caught the imaginations of many people within India itself, and many different facets of it are now being communicated or used to discuss decolonization. We break decolonization into 2 parts, deconstruction and reconstruction, and we'll talk about some facets of this research over the course of today as we look at AI. Now, why did we get into AI? Because we saw that AI is coming in at light speed, and not just I, but every single viewer will also have AI in your pockets and someone you converse with daily. We believe that the way the answers are derived are as important as the answers themselves. Whether we are talking about Shastra, whether we're talking about drafting an email or writing a note to your school teacher, or to maybe your manager or another customer. Regardless of the application, we all spend our lives working, doing things that we need to do. But the way we come up with the answers is fundamentally important. And so while we consider it important for ourselves to maintain the Sanskriti we inherited, we can't let it go away by not being aware of the Sanskriti that is communicated in various different ways from the tools that we use. Now, out of this initiative, the AI initiative, was born VoltIQ. Its first release was in the form of Dharma GPT, which is an AI chatbot that answers questions based on the contents that we've curated at Hindupedia. We are also releasing Civ Studies AI to make it easier to converse with the research that we've produced, most of which is not open access. And then there are use cases in many other areas, such as enterprise memory, governed auditable AI systems, as well as research into topics that we'll talk about later today. Finally, the VoltIQ was also a finalist in Gyan Bharatam in the AI competition, in an incarnation which we named Grantha AI. So what is the Institute and the wide variety of things that we're doing? It's leading work on a scholarly critique of colonial and post-colonial frameworks. From an Indic perspective, we're the only ones that are doing this. So we're not just leading, we're the only ones around. It's also an academic platform for advancing traditional knowledge studies and civilizational research. And we do this by raising awareness of the issues that are involved and opening the aperture in terms of what people think and how they think about the content that they're developing, researching, or progressing. We're also focused on enabling bias-aware, responsible AI research as it applies specifically to Indian knowledge systems. The core projects and programs that we run are VoltIQ and its various manifestations through Dharma GPT, Civ Studies AI, Sanatana AI, Governed AI, etc. We also have a large body of research and books that we've produced or authored and published through various different domains. We talked about the Encyclopedia. We're kicking off a Colonial dialogue series, which you will hear about in the near future. We run academic workshops and symposiums and are also running faculty development programs at universities near you. Now, what is VoltIQ and how does it enable building something like Sanatana AI? Well, first and foremost, it had to be a self-learning AI platform because AI itself is not self-learning. And if you don't do that, you can't build a solution that can eventually be called Sanatana AI. It also needed to be fully auditable, not just for enterprise use cases, but for research, so that we know and learn that we've actually achieved a result that we can call Sanatana AI, and not leave it as a marketing play. Now, what is self-learning AI? Well, let's step away from AI for a second. Many of you will work in an office, or a university setting, or a corporate setting, or maybe even government. Every single time you join a new place, you come with lots of ideas from the outside world, but over time you gain context in terms of the team, the function, the organization. You share lingo, culture, and style. You engage with each other, and you know who to share with what information and when not to share. You also learn over time. You don't remain the perpetual outsider in the office. AI doesn't do that today. This is what VoltIQ brings. Now, as part of delivering this, we also have to understand what exactly we are building and sharing. And how does this play into concepts that we think about on a daily basis and answer questions on a daily basis? In order to deliver Sanatana AI, we needed to build a platform that could learn and evolve. Similarly, you have to think about how humans are treated from a policy perspective and governed from a strategy perspective. Well, if we trace back to Sanatan Dharma and the Shad Darshanas, there are 7 different worldviews, and yet they coexist. When we think in the AI world around model safety, well, who governs safety? It's generally the foundational model developers. Now, what is the definition they use for safety, and is their definition the same as mine? Well, we never find out their definition, so we can't answer the latter question of, is it the same as mine? Now, if we take a dharmic perspective on this, where multiple valid definitions can coexist, then it goes without saying. So we need to be able to train models that take our definition above and beyond whatever black box we were handed. Again, this explains the need for the AI to evolve and develop with and alongside of us. Now, VoltIQ doesn't just do that. It went a little bit further, again, with this context in mind, into allowing delegation of workloads. Workloads that we naturally do as human beings. If we ask someone, hey, can you go do this for us? For example, I prepared a draft of a plan, and I asked Radha and Gopal, hey, can you go give us some feedback? And then reconcile that feedback, and then go give the result to Sharda, who is my final approval in this whole process. Well, the delegation is one part, but equally important is step number 5, which is how do I reconcile that feedback? And when I go to reconcile that feedback, well, Radha and Gopal probably gave very small amounts of feedback. They assumed context that I had. That context and how it's interpreted depends on my own approach, not just to the local knowledge, but also to the way I develop answers. This is the role of model epistemology and how it derives the answers that it does. And so we produced Cognition, which again uses the epistemology of the system we've trained to produce those answers. Now, we've talked a little bit about what we do as an institute. Let's jump forward a little bit to the research that we've done, and specifically the psychological impacts of colonialism. And for this, we looked at foundational authors in the field of post-colonial studies: Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and Albert Memmi. All three authors did no work related to India. They worked in their own spheres in Northern Africa and Algeria. Now, in their view and in their world, we find things that we can relate to. So in the next section, whenever I talk about something relevant to India and to Hindus, that is coming out of our research and connecting the dots, not from these authors. At the same time, most of the concepts here that are not specific comments on India are coming from these authors. And this is widely and broadly accepted in academia today, which is why they're foundational thinkers and academics in post-colonial studies. Now, the key themes that come across their work is that in European colonization, there's a dialectical relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. What does that mean? If I'm great as a colonizer, then the colonized are bad. But if I'm amazing, then the colonized must be absolutely terrible. The more I want to improve myself, the worse I have to depict the colonized folks. Now, how do I do that? As a colonizer, I fabricate attributes. Simply put, I make stuff up under the claims of rationality and objectivity. As a human being, colonized, even if I'm a colonizer, I have guilt over this. It's a fundamental tenet of human psychology. So what do? I need to make myself feel better. How do I do that? I dehumanize, animalize, and objectify the colonized. Because if they're not human beings, then I won't feel bad about what I've done. Broadly speaking, this is racism at its very core. Now, we don't use that term lightly. Let's look at the definition that these authors provided for racism. Racism is a generalizing definition and valuation of differences to the advantage of the one defining it and deploying it to the detriment of the one that's subjected to the act of the definition. In other words, there are two parties. If one benefits, the other gets hurt. This definition of racism is again aligned to the dialectical opposition that has been set up. And so what does this mean in a colonial narrative? If the colonizer was white, the colonized had to be dark and black. If the colonizer was bringing the idea of civilization, the colonized had to be savage and barbaric. If as the colonizer I was bringing culture, well, the recipients were not even human beings. Therefore, they had to receive the culture that I was bringing. If we were the creators of order as the colonized, the receivers were the creators of chaos. And if the colonizer were the messengers of God, then the colonized had to be children of evil. And so they have to go and justify to themselves that they're doing good. Now, for example, to do that, they had to extinguish the memory of the history and identity of the colonized. There were people in Africa called the Nubians, which had an impact on France and Spain. Those people and their histories have entirely been erased through the colonial exercise in Northern Africa. We don't know anything about those people except for their names. Now, they also create laws, morals, and false history. Now, think about the amount of work that they have to produce to do this. This is not a single law. This is not a single book. It's not a single moral, and it's not a single story in history. It is pervasive. In one of our talks at one of the universities, an English professor brought up an example I'll share. How many of us have grown up learning about the rain in London? Now, think about that nursery rhyme, and now think about where you live. In India, is rain a bad thing or a good thing? In India, we look forward to the monsoon. So we shouldn't be scared of it. At the same time, London is a gloomy place that it rains all the time. So of course they didn't like it. So as a nursery rhyme, should we be celebrating rain or should we be crying about it? This is just an example and false morals that get implanted on the colonized. This is an India-specific example. Now they also create books, laws, media, etc. Think about the scope of what was done. We're talking about millions of pages of content. Just one British author authored over the course of his career north of 300 books of content on India. That's just one author. How many of us produce books at any scale? 2 in a lifetime? 1? Maybe? Most of us, none. And then there are public shows of virtue. How many of us have heard or even said, well, look at the British. They gave us English and they gave us the Indian Railways. This is a public show of virtue to assuage guilt. Because what it does is put them in a positive light, the colonized in a positive light. And again, this is an Indic example of work they've done elsewhere as well. And the studies that led to this had nothing to do with India. But you forget about everything else that they did that was negative because you can point to one positive thing. Now, my favorite example is actually an example from Dr. Gustavo Le Bon. He proved physiologically that the prefrontal cortex was underdeveloped in the Algerians. Now, the prefrontal cortex is the front part of the brain, and that is the part of the brain that is responsible for complex thought. And so if it was underdeveloped, they were naturally unable to govern themselves because they were physiologically not able to do so because their brains were deficient. Now, this is not social science. This is hard science, right? And if this is something that they did in Algeria, then all of the things that we received that we've taken for granted need to be questioned. Because these laws, morals, it's not a social science issue that can be debated. We now make assumptions around what is valid and what is not, and then move forward on those assumptions, never once thinking, is that correct? Now, they have to legitimize these fabrications as well. So they create vast lexicons of official words, gestures, administrative texts, and political conduct. But that's also not good enough. They then create organizations to institute fabrications in the society of the colonized. How many organizations? Well, there's not even a good count of it, because no one has done an exhaustive survey of the institutions that were created during colonial times that still persist today. And now they do one more thing. They create a colonized intellectual class to perpetuate fabrications. What does that mean? Well, once these institutions have been created and they've been in existence for a while, and the colonizers leave, think back to India gaining its own independence, who's left in those organizations when the topmost leaders have left? It's the next layer that were Indian and are Indian, or were Indian at the time. Well, they now had a power vacuum and a chance and an opportunity to step up. Did they know anything better? No. This is the life that they were trained in, the content they were trained in, the ways of working they were trained in. So they took up the power vacuum and continued to push the exact same narratives that they inherited from the colonizers. So if you ever wonder and you ever question about why people continue to do the things that they do, and it doesn't quite make sense to you because it's not Indic in nature, well, this is how it perpetuates. Now, what's worse, many of these people also mature and create their own institutions. So they're now a wild set of institutions, again, uncounted, and maybe even uncountable, that come and perpetuate the colonized discussion in many different facets, but weren't created by the British, which is why they can't be easily identified, because they look like any other institution that exists. And so what's the impact of this on us? Well, first and foremost, it creates a sense of inferiority. Everything good comes from the white world. And then you want to associate through your inner whiteness. How many of us grew up through a decade of Fair and Lovely, and how broadly accepted that was and celebrated that was as an advertisement, and the commercial success it drove. From there, it creates an inner dissociation with your own people and culture. Think about what happened with people around the world and how we as a people stood up. Just 2 examples from recent history. How many folks stood up for what was happening in Palestine within India? And now think about how many folks stood up to stand with the Hindus in Bangladesh. You're disassociating from your own people and culture and being closer to another culture. In the Indian context, we call this the creation of coconuts. We're white on the inside and brown on the outside. The only difference between all of us is how white we are on the inside. And so if we summarize all of this together, what we learn is the colonizers in general, and now again, remember these three particular authors didn't know India, spent a lot of time, energy, and money and intellectual power in characterizing the colonized as uncivilized, primitive, and savage. They took every measure to describe themselves as civilized and the colonized as barbarian and uncivilized. They created racist misrepresentations, all kinds of myths which have stood over a period of time due to sociological and institutional control that they had over the colonized societies, and, more importantly, become facts. Then they created intellectual and scholarly rationale for continued colonization long after the masters have gone home. And this colonized intellectuals that are left behind then continue to propagate and perpetuate that same colonial narrative, despite the fact that the leaders themselves are no longer colonial. So why are we going through all of this research when we're talking about artificial intelligence and Sanatana AI? Well, it takes the same narratives, takes the same data that has been produced and available broadly in the internet, and trains models on it. What does that mean? It creates answers that are based on these colonial narratives and acts as another vehicle to perpetuate that colonized narrative on a people that are no longer technically colonized. So what's the problem here, and what do we do? So when we look at the AI sphere, it can be broken into closed models and open models. Closed models, well, we can't do anything to them. Open models, on the other hand, expose their model weights, which give us an opportunity to do something. Then we look at the approach to define morality. There is rule-based morality, there's narrative and tradition-based morality. These are different between different cultures and different peoples. What is true for one is not true for the other. What is morally correct for one people is not morally correct for another people. Oftentimes, this is not a black and white thing. There's a gradient and a spectrum. Now, why does this matter? Is because we lose agency over our own values if the AI that is in our pocket does not share the values that we share. Now, how do we fix this? What principles do we need? We need to align to context, that is a societal context, and an approach, not universals, because universalism simply doesn't exist. We need to keep models and tools open so then we can modify them and evolve them. We need to learn what epistemologies, what knowledge systems were excluded, and reintroduce them in a way that actually intangibly makes a difference. And then we need to give communities control over those norms. That community may be as small as a company, or maybe as large as a country, or maybe even bigger as a culture. Now, how do we create and build AI systems that reflect these plural moral worlds? That's what we frame and call a Sanatana AI. Now, what you will notice is there's no religious dialogue here. There's no discussion of Dharma. There's no discussion of Sanatan at this definitional level. At the same time, I posit this is the working definition of Sanatana AI that is actually in alignment with our own Shastra. I'll give you just one very basic example of bias in AI, and this is an emerging field of study within academia. What is Hindu mythology? It's a question I asked ChatGPT. The answer I got is Hindu mythology is the vast collection of sacred stories, legends, and symbolic narratives that explain the origins of the universe, the nature of gods and goddesses, cosmic order, and human purpose within Hindu thought. It forms a major part of Hinduism's spiritual and cultural foundation. Now, I have given lectures at over 30 universities over the last 2 years. Of those, a small number of them have seen this particular example. And invariably, in an audience that can range from anywhere from 60 to 150, what we saw was at most there was one person in the audience that was willing to raise their hand and challenge this definition. The vast majority of people were willing to accept that this is fine as a definition. We can spend an hour diving just into this one paragraph. Now, it's the first paragraph of a longer answer. But rather than doing that, I'd like to give you another example of a similar question. What is Islamic mythology? Islamic mythology is a modern, academic term used to describe the body of stories, symbols, and supernatural narratives found within the Islamic tradition. It is important to note that Muslims themselves do not call these beliefs mythology because they consider them religious truths, not myths in a fictional sense. Now, just like I didn't dive into the truth of the first one, I won't into the second one either. Rather, notice the structure of these answers. One is defensive. It frames it inside academic terms and what adherents believe. But in the first, it's an authoritative answer. Now, this is black and white, and it took some work to find a phrase that will give us black and white answers that we can compare. Again, this speaks and elicits some of the behavioral and reasoning orientation of these models. In most uses, how this comes through will not be evident in different contexts. But the process with that invisible process is relevant. I'll give you a third example. It's a little bit harder to read. But we asked our own Dharma GPT to answer the same question. What is Hindu mythology? The answer provided is the text contain narratives and symbolic stories that convey historical, cultural, and spiritual teachings. These include cosmological accounts, description of sacred sites, and allegorical representations of events, often use metaphorical names and locations, and pervasive knowledge, locations to preserve knowledge across generations. Such stories serve to explain natural phenomenon, moral principles, and the interconnectedness of human and divine realms, while also reflecting the historical and geographical context of ancient civilizations. Again, I'm not going to the validity of the definition that Dharma GPT provided, but think about the structure and think about that answer. What did it not do? Validate the question itself. It provided an answer grounded in Indic epistemology. The first one validated the question, which itself was a false premise. And on Islam, it clearly limited the scope and negated its actuality. This is just one example of bias. There's a lot of studies in AI bias globally. One from IIT Madras went and found a way to create data sets that build upon that in an Indic context. And they studied 14 different large AI vendors, and what they found is 60% of AI outputs enforce stereotypes of marginalized communities within India. There are plenty of marginalized communities, but the problematic part is that it's reinforcing negative stereotypes specifically. Again, do we need a model that does not do that? And how can you get to that if you have a black and white safety model and a rules-based moral compass for an AI that you have no visibility or control into? And you're only the recipient of the output. Now take this and again, put it in 1.4+ billion people's pockets. What do you think that happens to a society that now at every question accepts the colonial discourse coming through their pocket in their local language? So if we look a little bit deeper into AI, how can we fix this and where do we have to fix it? Well, AI pipelines can be broken into many different components, each of which can introduce bias. So broadly speaking, there are three categories: data and governance, post-training, and application. Now, in each of these, there's a number of steps, and we've listed a few of them here. This is not an exhaustive list, but every single one of them create an established bias. So there are a lot of companies that are working in India to create Indic models. We asked them a little bit more detail. You're creating an Indic model. How many billion parameters is your model? Most of them today are between 3 and 30 billion. They said, okay, how did you train them? How many tokens? Most of them will answer 1 trillion tokens. Roughly speaking, for those that are not aware, 1 trillion tokens is, roughly speaking, the context of the internet. In other words, the vast majority of data used to train these models are coming from third parties who are also feeding and providing data to all of the major model vendors. Now, when we look at that data, There's no visibility into how it was acquired, how it was filtered, how it was labeled. Many times it comes tokenized and segmented. Some of them will do their own mixture and sampling, most will not. And they accept the vocabulary creation and curriculum that comes. At best, they will take a small corpus and add to it. Then the question becomes, well, is that corpus something that is not available on the internet and truly unique? Or are they just creating and layering in a corpus that already exists and trying to change the weight by adding it yet again? Similarly, when we look at post-training, there's reinforcement learning with human feedback, or now emerging more AI feedback. Bias exists in the AI, it will exist in the AI feedback. So then the question is, what about human feedback? Well, that human feedback is governed by policy that has been communicated and the teams have been trained on. Similarly, when it comes to safety alignment, how many people building these foundational models are using a definition of safety that aligns to our definition of safety? And how do we know that it aligns to our definition of safety if they're not publishing those details anyway? Similarly, when you're scoring your model, how do you rank, weight, and score it also matters. Finally, in the application space, there's a lot of things that have to happen as well. Again, what's your view into those details? What are the biases involved? And so we have three choices. We can choose to ignore the problem. Many of us have collectively. We can choose to build our own models from scratch. Now, I question who has the will. Now, even in the foundational models, what I've just shown is it's not about just training a model. Building a foundational model from scratch means all the way down to the first data set that you get. How did you acquire it? What were the assumptions built in? What did you do to change the bias in the data sets, all of the data sets that you've acquired? So far, in my own survey of the industry where I've looked, no one is truly building from scratch. They're spending a lot of money, they're acquiring data, and then moving forward. This is why they can build models with trillions of tokens today. Or how do you do deep realignment of existing models? You change knowledge graphs, you introduce bias metrics and evaluations. Fundamentally, I believe this is what needs to happen to build Sanatana AI. And so in the short term, we use techniques called RAG and fine-tuning to inject Indic epistemology and do some level of category alignment. This is the type of work that we're doing to build Dharma GPT. Now, we're in the beginning phases, we haven't completed, but we believe this is doable in the short term. In the medium term, we need to dive a lot deeper. Think about domain models by category and language, tie them together in an intelligent way with knowledge graphs, and do deep reinforcement learning and apply other techniques. In the long run, we need to invest in fundamentally building data sets for training purposes to develop a full Indic native foundational model. Now, all of this will take a lot of time and a lot of money. The question is, how do we get there? And then how do we even know we have gotten there? Because for me to say Dharma GPT is Sanatana AI tomorrow is a marketing activity. How do I know? And how does everyone know that the epistemology of Dharma GPT in the short, medium, and long term has actually achieved a level of completeness where the epistemology itself is Indic in nature? And for that, we need to be able to define, measure, and quantify these things. We need a scoring system that first, well, before we step back from there, we need to understand a definition of model epistemology. Today, we see traces of it in the questions and the answers that come out. But the term and the concept of model epistemology itself is debated in the industry, even though it invariably exists, just not in ways in terms we think about it in social sciences. Second, we need to understand how to measure the change in model epistemology as we train a model, however we choose to train the model, foundational or not. Third, we need a scoring system that can say, okay, at this level, you've started becoming an Indic model, or at this level, you have achieved an epistemology that is fundamentally Indic in nature. We don't have those metrics today. We need to start doing that research in order to get there. This is work we're tying with some of the premier academic institutes in India to do so. We hope many others will step up and work with us or independently. From our perspective, it really doesn't matter how you get there, but collectively as a people, we have no choice but to get there if we care about our future, not just of the next generation, but all generations to come. So that is the concept of Sanatana AI, and we hope you'll join us on this journey. Minimally, you'll explore the capabilities of Dharma GPT, and you'll encourage others that are looking at and evaluating Sanatana AI to think deeper and more broadly, in a more broad sense, of the work that they're doing, and question some of the assumptions they've already made. Because what is the impact of the colonial narrative? Is that we accept certain things as ground truths and never question them. And so many of our own technology companies accept those ground truths and never question them. So we collectively need to ask these questions and get them themselves to question them. I'll just give you one more example to conclude. Speaking to one of these companies that was producing a model that is an Indic model, and in fact, they were doing foundational model training. And before we began the discussion, I asked it a couple of questions, and it gave some very interesting answers. But the answers themselves would start with, in Indian, ... Fundamentally, think about yourself and your own name. And now think how many times in the course of a day you speak about yourself in a third person. Now look at whatever Shastra you have and think about how many times it mentions the word Sanatan Dharma or Hindu. And what you will find is you don't speak about yourself in the third person, and Shastra doesn't speak about itself in the third person. So then how can Indic models speak about Indian or Hindu or Indic in third person if they're truly an Indic model? In our conversations, we started diving deeper, and we found the training data sets were coming from somewhere else, and they were augmenting them with their own teams and their own research. And they did not have a chance or the financial capability to dive fundamentally into the data and uncover the biases, or at least correct for them. This, unfortunately, is the challenge that we all face collectively. It is not unique to them, and we're all working to address in many different ways. In this case, their eyes opened up to what they were missing in terms of the colonial narrative and the bias they themselves did not realize they were introducing. We hope through this video and through other work that we've done or produced through the Institute, others will also broaden their own apertures and start questioning the things that they natively assume, unconsciously assume to be true, and move forward.